You said you would start immediately. But your body is still waiting for a signal that never comes. And in that delay, your discipline is already collapsing. This is where action is enforced before permission exists. The moment arrives quietly. No pressure from outside. No urgency. Just the simple requirement to move. Your hand rests where the work begins, but it does not lift. The delay is small, barely noticeable, but it repeats. Again and again. The body waits for confirmation that never arrives. Inside, the same pattern tightens. A brief pause. A silent check. Am I ready? The question feels harmless, almost responsible. But it is not a question. It is a gate. And every time you ask it, you step back from the action instead of into it. Nothing is blocking you. The environment is still. The task is clear. But the body remains unmoved, caught in that narrow space between intention and execution. That space is where your discipline is being decided, the 2-second delay. The delay is never dramatic. It does not announce itself as failure. It appears as a small pause, 2 seconds, maybe less, between knowing and doing. You sit there, hand close to movement, but not moving. The body feels slightly heavy, like it's waiting for something to align before it commits. And in that moment, the negotiation begins again. Just wait a second. Start in a better position. Make sure it feels right. The thoughts are quiet. Reasonable. They don't sound like weakness. They sound like preparation. But the body does not move. And that is the only signal that matters. The same pattern repeats in different forms. You wake up at the right time, but you stay seated on the edge of the bed. Your feet press lightly into the floor, but they don't stand. The air is still. Nothing is stopping you. Yet something inside insists on waiting. That insistence is not loud. It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like control. But it is not control. It is delay disguised as judgment. The body tightens slightly. Shoulders hold still. Fingers press without gripping. Breath stays shallow, like it hasn't committed either. Everything is prepared, but nothing is executed. And because nothing happens, nothing feels wrong. That is where the pattern becomes invisible. You don't register it as failure because the gap is so small. You tell yourself you're about to start. You believe action is seconds away. But those seconds stretch, again and again, until the action disappears completely. This is how inconsistency survives. Not through collapse. Not through refusal. But through hesitation so small it avoids detection. The mind plays its role carefully. It does not reject the task. It does not rebel. It simply inserts a condition. Wait until it feels right. That condition becomes the rule. And because the feeling never fully arrives, the action never fully begins. So the body remains in that suspended state, ready, but inactive. Present, but unmoving. Over time, this creates a false identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who intends to act. Someone who is close to discipline. Someone who is almost there. But almost becomes permanent. The same 2-second delay appears in every critical moment. Before training. Before work. Before any action that requires commitment without comfort. And each time, the outcome is the same. You hesitate. You negotiate. You wait. And the action dissolves before it even starts. No external force is required. No obstacle needs to exist. The system fails entirely within that narrow gap between intention and execution. That gap is where your discipline is being quietly removed. Not in hours. Not in missed days. In seconds. And until that gap is closed, nothing else will hold. The pattern that pretends to be control. And it doesn't stop at the edge of the bed. The same delay follows you into every task that requires immediate movement. You stand in front of the work again. Same posture, same stillness, and the body repeats what it has already learned. Pause first. Act later. Except later never arrives. The pattern becomes more efficient the more you allow it. The hesitation shortens, but it deepens. You no longer need a full internal sentence. Sometimes it's just a feeling, something slightly off, slightly unaligned. And that is enough to stop the movement. Your hand reaches, then slows. Your body leans forward, then holds. The motion begins, but it never completes. And again, nothing feels broken. That is what makes this pattern dangerous. It does not feel like avoidance. It feels like precision. You start to believe that this delay is part of doing things properly. That waiting improves execution. That hesitation refines the action. But look at the result. Nothing is being refined. Nothing is being executed. The body is learning something else entirely. It is learning that action requires permission. And every time you hesitate, you reinforce that rule. The environment does not change. The task does not change. But your response becomes predictable. You arrive at the moment, and instead of moving, you check. Instead of executing, you evaluate. The delay becomes automatic. You don't even notice when it happens anymore. You sit down to begin, and somehow minutes pass. You pick up the tool, and somehow it returns to rest. You prepare everything correctly, and still nothing starts. From the outside, it looks like discipline is close. Everything is in place. Timing is correct. Conditions are acceptable. But the one thing that matters, movement, is missing. And because there is no visible collapse, no obvious failure, you allow it to continue. Quietly. Consistently. Every day. Inside, the same negotiation pattern tightens its hold. Just one more second. Let it settle first. Start clean, not rushed. These phrases do not feel like excuses. They feel like control mechanisms. But they all point in the same direction, away from immediate action. The body remains still, waiting for a moment that feels correct. But that moment does not exist. There is no signal coming. No internal green light will appear. And yet, you keep waiting for it. This is where the pattern locks in. Because now, the hesitation is no longer something you notice. It is something you trust. You trust the pause. You trust the delay. You trust the feeling that says not yet. And that trust replaces discipline entirely. The body no longer moves because it must. It moves only when it feels ready. And since readiness is unstable, your action becomes unstable. That is the real shift. You are no longer dealing with occasional hesitation. You are operating under a system where hesitation decides everything. And as long as that system remains in control, every task, no matter how simple, will pass through the same gate. Wait. Check. Delay. And then, nothing. The pattern is now complete, where the war actually happens. The delay no longer feels like a mistake. It feels like part of the process. That's when it becomes dangerous. Because now, when the moment comes, when your body is supposed to move, you don't even question the pause. You accept it. You let it happen. The same 2 seconds open again, but this time, there's no resistance to the hesitation itself. You stopped fighting the delay. And that is where the internal war shifts. The conflict is no longer between action and resistance. It is between awareness and obedience. You see the hesitation happen. You recognize it. There is a brief flash, this is the same pattern, but the body still does not move. The recognition is there, but it does not convert into action. Because another layer has formed underneath. Just this once. It doesn't sound like collapse. It sounds controlled, measured, temporary. But it repeats every time. And each time, It weakens the link between knowing and doing. Your body leans forward slightly. Muscles engage just enough to suggest movement. But they don't follow through. The motion stops halfway, like a command was issued and then quietly cancelled. That cancellation is the real problem. Not the hesitation itself. The cancellation. Because now, even when movement begins, it is not guaranteed to finish. Your system has learned that starting is optional, and finishing is negotiable. And that destroys consistency at its root. Inside, the negotiation pattern tightens into something faster, sharper. No need to rush. You'll do it properly in a moment. Better to wait than to do it wrong. The language evolves, but the outcome stays the same. Delay. The body reflects it. Your posture holds tension without release. Shoulders slightly raised, as if preparing to act, but frozen. Breath pauses mid-cycle, like it's waiting for a signal to continue. Everything is in a state of partial engagement. Nothing is fully committed. That partial state becomes your default. You are always about to act, but rarely acting. And over time, this creates a deeper fracture. You begin to separate intention from behavior completely. You trust your intentions. You believe your plans. You identify as someone who is disciplined in thought. But your body follows a different system. A slower one. A conditional one. A system where action is filtered through feeling, timing, and internal approval. And because of that filter, most actions never pass through. This is where people start to feel stuck. Not because they don't know what to do. Not because they lack ability. But because the moment of execution has been compromised. The gate is broken. And every action must pass through that gate. So even the simplest movement, standing up, starting, lifting, stepping forward, becomes uncertain. Not difficult. Uncertain. Because the body no longer trusts itself to complete what it begins. And once that trust is gone, hesitation expands. It spreads into every part of the day. You don't just delay the difficult things. You delay everything. Small tasks. Simple actions. Even movements that require no effort at all. Because the pattern is no longer tied to difficulty. It is tied to identity. You have become someone who pauses before acting. And until that identity is broken, the pattern will continue, clean, quiet, and constant, without ever needing to justify itself. The structure that cuts the delay. And once that identity settles, nothing changes, until something removes the pause entirely. Not reduces it. Not manages it. Removes it. Because the delay is not a feeling problem. It is not a motivation problem. It is a structural failure. You are still allowing a gap to exist between command and action. And as long as that gap exists, hesitation will fill it. So the system must close the gap. Completely. No space for checking. No space for aligning. No space for waiting. The moment the command appears, the body moves. Not after. Not when ready. At the exact moment. That is the structure. It does not negotiate with the delay. It replaces it. You wake up, and your feet hit the floor immediately. Not because you feel prepared, but because there is no alternative path defined. The sequence is already set. Wake, stand. No condition in between. The body resists at first. It feels abrupt. Unstable. Almost incorrect. Your muscles react with tension, like they were interrupted mid-process. The breath catches slightly as movement happens without the usual internal approval. That reaction is expected. Because the old system is still present, trying to insert the pause. Wait. Not yet. Give it a second. But the structure does not listen. It does not interpret. It executes. Again and again, the same sequence repeats. No variation. No adjustment based on feeling. The body begins to recognize that the command is no longer a suggestion. It is a trigger. And triggers do not wait. This is where the shift begins, not in thought, but in timing. The gap starts to shrink. At first, it is still there, but shorter. The hesitation tries to appear, but the body moves before it fully forms. The negotiation begins, but it is cut off mid-sentence by action. That interruption is critical. Because now, for the first time, the pattern is being broken in real time. Not after reflection. Not through analysis. Through immediate override. Your hand lifts before the thought completes. Your body stands before the feeling settles. The motion happens without waiting for internal confirmation. And that creates friction. The body feels slightly out of sync. Movements are less smooth, less perfect, but they are happening. And that is the correction. Because perfection was never the goal. Execution was. The system becomes simple, almost mechanical. When the moment arrives, move. No interpretation layer. No emotional filter. No internal approval required. Just sequence. The more you repeat this, the more the old pattern loses ground. The hesitation still attempts to appear, but it arrives too late. The body has already acted. That is how the delay is removed. Not by eliminating resistance, but by outrunning it. The structure does not make you feel ready. It makes readiness irrelevant. And once readiness is no longer part of the process, the identity begins to shift. You are no longer someone who waits to act. You are someone who acts before waiting can begin, when others start to notice. And once the body begins to move without waiting, the friction doesn't stay internal. It becomes visible. At first, it's subtle. You respond faster than before. You begin tasks without the usual pause. While others are still adjusting, still checking, still preparing, you've already started. That difference creates tension. Not loud, not confrontational, but present. Someone watches you move immediately and says, "Relax, you don't have to rush." Another laughs slightly. "Why are you so serious about it?" Someone else pauses mid-action, noticing your pace doesn't match theirs. The room doesn't change, but your timing does. And that makes people uncomfortable. Because your behavior removes the shared delay they rely on. Most people operate inside that same gap, waiting, checking, aligning. It's a silent agreement. No one moves too quickly. No one commits too early. There's always a moment of hesitation built into the environment. You step outside of it. And now your actions expose it. You don't say anything. You don't explain. You just move when the moment arrives. No visible preparation. No hesitation signal. Just execution. And that creates pressure around you. Conversation shifts slightly. People begin to comment, not directly on your discipline, but on your behavior. "You're intense lately. You don't even think about it, huh? Take it easy, it's not that serious." They interpret your removal of hesitation as excess. Because to them, the pause is normal. The delay is part of how things are done. But your body no longer participates in that pattern. You don't wait for the group to align. You don't slow down to match the shared hesitation. You don't adopt the same timing just to remain comfortable within it. So the distance grows. Not physically. Behaviorally. You begin to operate on a different rhythm, one that doesn't require approval or synchronization with others. And that rhythm highlights something most people avoid seeing. They are still waiting. Even when they don't need to. Even when nothing is stopping them. They wait because it feels normal. You don't. And that difference creates quiet separation. Not through conflict. Through contrast. The more consistent your action becomes, the more visible that contrast gets. People start to anticipate your response. They expect you to move immediately. They notice the absence of hesitation before you even act. Your behavior becomes predictable. Not because it is forced, but because it is fixed. And that predictability removes the final layer of negotiation. There is no moment where you decide whether to act. There is only the moment, and the action that follows. That's when the shift begins to stabilize. Not just inside you, but around you. Because now, the environment no longer influences your timing. Your timing defines how you move through the environment. And it does not adjust, the moment gets removed. And once your timing stops adjusting, the environment loses its hold completely. There is no longer a moment to step into. No build-up. No preparation. The action does not begin when the situation feels right. It begins when the sequence demands it. The moment itself becomes irrelevant, because the system no longer depends on it. Before, everything revolved around that moment. You waited for it. You checked it. You judged whether it was good enough to act in. That single point in time controlled everything. Now, it's gone. The sequence runs without asking. You reach the task, and the body moves immediately, not because the timing is perfect, but because timing is no longer a variable. The command exists, so the action follows. No pause. No check. No delay. At first, this feels unnatural in a different way. There is no mental preparation, no internal alignment. The body enters action cold, without the familiar lead-in that used to justify movement. Your hands start working before your thoughts catch up. Your body shifts position before your mind confirms it. There is a brief disconnect, like the system is operating faster than your awareness. That is not a problem. That is the correction. Because awareness was never supposed to be the gatekeeper. The more this repeats, the less the system relies on any internal condition. Energy level doesn't matter. Mood doesn't matter. Even clarity doesn't matter. The structure absorbs all of it and still produces the same output. Action. Even when the body feels heavy, it moves. Even when the mind is slow, it executes. Even when nothing feels aligned, the sequence continues. And this is where most systems break, but yours doesn't. Because the structure has already accounted for those states. There is no requirement for ideal conditions. There is only a requirement for continuity. So when resistance appears, and it still does, it has nowhere to insert itself. There is no opening. No gap. No moment to negotiate inside of. The old pattern tries to return. A brief hesitation attempts to form. A slight pause appears at the edge of movement. The same internal voice starts to rise. Wait. But it gets cut off. Not silenced. Interrupted. Because the body has already moved. That interruption happens again and again, until the hesitation loses its timing advantage. It can still appear, but it arrives too late to control anything. And when hesitation loses control of timing, it loses control completely. Now the system runs forward without needing reinforcement. It doesn't require focus. It doesn't require intensity. It only requires that the sequence continues exactly as it was set. No variation. No exception. No delay. That's when the final shift begins to take shape, not as effort, but as inevitability. The action is no longer something you choose to do. It is something that happens, when action becomes identity. And once action begins to happen on its own, something else disappears with it. The need to decide. Before, every movement passed through a question. Will you do it now? Is this the right time? Are you ready? That question no longer appears. Not because you answered it. Because it no longer exists in the system. The sequence has replaced it completely. You arrive at the moment, and there is no internal check, no brief pause, no subtle scan for alignment. The body moves the same way it has been trained to move, directly, without interruption. And this is where the shift becomes visible in a different way. Not just in speed, in certainty. Your actions stop looking like effort. They stop looking like discipline in the traditional sense. There is no visible strain, no visible push, no moment where it looks like you are forcing yourself through resistance. Because the resistance is no longer part of the execution layer. It may still exist in the background, fatigue, distraction, low energy, but it does not sit between command and action anymore. It has been pushed out of the pathway completely. So what remains is clean, direct, predictable. You move when the sequence demands it. Not early, not late. Exactly when required. And because this happens every time, the behavior stabilizes into something else. Not a habit. An identity. You no longer think of yourself as someone trying to act without hesitation. You are someone who does not hesitate. There is no internal label applied. No affirmation. No conscious declaration. The identity forms from repetition so consistent that deviation starts to feel incorrect. Not difficult. Incorrect. If a delay tries to return, it stands out immediately. It feels foreign. Out of place. The body recognizes it as something that does not belong in the system anymore. And because it doesn't belong, it doesn't stay. Action corrects it instantly. That is the final layer. Not forcing yourself to act. Not reminding yourself to act. But existing in a system where action is the only available response. Others continue to operate inside their own timing, waiting, checking, adjusting. You see it now, clearly. The pauses. The hesitation. The small delays that once felt invisible. But you are no longer inside that pattern. You don't judge it. You don't engage with it. You simply move. And that movement no longer feels like effort. It feels normal. Expected. Unavoidable. There is no conversation left inside the moment. No argument. No delay. Just execution. No readiness required. You were never waiting for the right moment. You were waiting for permission. Permission to begin. Permission to feel ready. Permission to move without resistance. And because that permission never arrives in a stable form, your action never stabilizes either. But now, that entire layer is gone. There is no readiness check left in the system. No internal signal to wait for. No condition that needs to be satisfied before movement begins. The action is no longer connected to how you feel, how prepared you are, or how aligned the moment seems. It is connected only to the sequence. And the sequence does not hesitate. This is where the separation becomes final. You are no longer someone trying to overcome hesitation. You are someone who removed the space where hesitation used to exist. That is the difference. Not stronger will. Not better focus. Structural removal. The gap is gone. So nothing enters. No delay. No negotiation. No silent agreement to wait just a second. When the moment appears, it does not expand into a question. It closes immediately into action. And because that happens every time, the system no longer needs reinforcement. You don't think about discipline. You don't check if you're aligned. You don't prepare yourself mentally. You move. That is the identity now. Not built through belief. Not maintained through motivation. But locked through repetition that left no alternative path. The body knows what happens next before the mind can interfere. And that is where consistency becomes permanent. There is no readiness required for what you do. Because what you do has already been decided. And it happens the same way, every time.